Hello and a warm welcome to the debate on Press TV. I'm your host, Behruz Najafi. Senior U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham told reporters during his recent trip to Tel Aviv that he expects Washington to swiftly authorize $1 billion for Israel to replenish its Iron Dome missile defense system. The much bragged about defense system proved to be vulnerable to Hamas's retaliatory rockets from Gaza in the course of last month's Israeli aggression on Palestinians. Graham said that he expected Tel Aviv's requests for money to find favor with both President Biden and Congress. And this, of course, on top of the regular monetary aid that Washington extends to Tel Aviv on a yearly basis. Now let's start tonight's debate show. Let's go first to Ramallah in the occupied Palestinian territory. Mona Kendall, our correspondent, is there. Mona, tell us about the reaction of the Palestinians regarding this U.S. decision.
Well, Palestinians believe that it's a good investment for Israel. Israel is seeking additional $1 billion from Washington. The request comes amid growing criticism of American arms sale to Israel, as well as the $3.8 billion in unconditioned aid to U.S. gives to Israel every year. Now, progressive legislators in both the U.S. House of Representatives and the Senate are currently attempting to block the $735 million in arms deal with Israel, which the White House approved just before Israel started its aggression on the Gaza Strip. But experts at the end of the day are saying that support for Israel remains strong among the majority of U.S. legislators, and the efforts to curtail it are all but assured to fail. Now, Benny Gantz is in the United States, according to many, is in order to get reaffirmation from the United States security for commitments to Israel, as well to aid it, especially in the aftermath of its aggression and airstrikes on the Gaza Strip.
Okay, thanks for that, Mona Kandil, Press TV correspondent in Ramallah. Now, joining me in tonight's debate will be a couple of guests. First, let's call in the editor of the Liberation News, Walter Smolarek from Philadelphia. Good to have you with us, Walter. Senator Graham has given the Israeli officials assurances of, quote, U.S.-wide and deep support for Israel among the Democratic Party. What's the underlying reason for such an unflinching support?
Well, I think that the United States' alliance with Israel is based on essentially the United States' desire to dominate the Middle East. It's an extremely geopolitically important strategic area, and the United States, which has a hegemonic orientation towards the world. You know, the Pentagon, the State Department, their goal is for the United States, I mean, in the words of Joe Biden, to win the 21st century. And that was certainly the case with the 20th century as well. And Israel provides the United States a reliable, dependable ally. You know, they have other allies, junior partners, proxies in the region, but Israel is uniquely militarily powerful and uniquely internally stable. And so it makes for an ideal, essentially, watchdog in the region that is willing, more than willing, to use devastating military force against political movements or independent governments that try to act outside of essentially what the United States wants to do or wants them to do. So for that reason, there is this extreme sort of hardline pro-Israel sentiment that exists among large parts of the political elite. But I think that, you know, what's motivating that statement in particular is actually a feeling of insecurity, that the tide of public opinion in the United States is beginning to turn, especially among young people, and this is reflected in opinion polling, turning against Israel, and greater solidarity and sympathy with the Palestinian cause is growing as well. And so, you know, the most extreme pro-Israel politicians are really in a state of panic about this. I think that it's becoming not an ironclad consensus across all different political factions and trends and tendencies among the Washington elite, but is actually being challenged now. And that's, of course, primarily due to grassroots pressure and lots of years of organizing in many different places.
Okay. Now, from Brussels, let me invite journalist and political analyst Elijah Magnier. Elijah, good to have you with us. Washington gave Tel Aviv $146 billion in bilateral assistance and missile defense funding through the year 2020. Couldn't that colossal amounts of money be used inside America to address the many issues at home?
Thank you for having me. Indeed, sure. Yes. It is commitment the Americans have taken since 19 support Israel. And actually, it is not only supporting Israel financially, but it's supporting every single war Israel is carrying out in the Middle East against its neighboring countries. And when the Americans are supporting Israel in financing it to rebuild this arsenal and to buy more weapons and to create more military technology, it is encouraging Israel to fight a more war in the Middle East rather than reconstructing the world that is much in need of. And particularly the United States of America, there are shortages of everything there. And we see the generosity of the American administration, every single American administration so generous toward Israel, is really what they are trying is to say to the Middle East and send a message that we are ready to invest a lot of money on wars, but we're not ready to invest money on the reconstruction. And if you look at the amount of financial support that the U.S. said is going to help Gaza with, $110 million, when they are supporting Israel with 3.8 plus an additional 1 billion that the Israeli minister is asking from the Pentagon today in Washington. Therefore, it's clearly the priority of the Americans is to keep Israel superiority and to make sure that whenever Israel wants to wage war in the Middle East, it is always supported by the U.S. And it's not only the financial support. You have the 7th Fleet in the area, you have American soldiers and American effectives in Israel and around Israel in other Middle Eastern countries supporting Israel whenever Israel declares war, either on Gaza or on Lebanon or bomb Syria.
Now, Walter, some American legislators are skeptical if U.S. funding for Israel is being used against Palestinians living under military occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip, which is in violation of U.S. laws. You may know that 300 American representatives signed a letter on April 15 to ensure that U.S. funding is not used for Israel's ill treatment of Palestinian children, forced displacement of Palestinian families through home demolitions, and illegal and land annexation and eviction. So how effective can such anti-Tel Aviv moves prove to be?
Well, I think it would be very important to take those steps to make it clear that no U.S. military aid can be used, for these crimes. But of course, all of the military aid that the United States gives to Israel is in one way, shape, or form propping up the military apparatus that has as its very purpose for being the displacement of Palestinians, waging war on the countries surrounding Israel, again, in the interests of U.S. domination, and just bolstering the military and political and diplomatic standing of this apartheid regime. And so that's why, the Palestine Solidarity Movement in the United States and, of course, elsewhere has been calling for an end to all aid to Israel. All assistance of whatever sort is one way or another putting Israel in a position where it can carry out these terrible atrocities against children, against civilians, and the core of all of that, which is just the war of aggression in the first place, that the military engagements that Israel takes part in are for territorial expansion, which is a war crime, which is, a fundamental war crime. In fact, when you look at the Charter of the United Nations, the Geneva Convention, it's the most patently illegal thing you can do.
Okay. Now, Elijah, the Israeli aggression in Gaza drew some criticism from a number of Democrats, but as you know, Israel generally enjoys strong support in Washington from both parties. Now, Congress routinely approves large sums of military funding for America's solid partner in the Middle East region. Let's have your comment on that.
It is a sign that the Americans would like to show to the world that there is a kind of democracy when it is related to Israel. In fact, in reality, the end of the line, Israel will get all the support it wanted. And even if there are voices that support of the Israelis, even if there are today, particularly after the war on Gaza, because the world can't ignore the number of children and women and elderly killed and the civilian infrastructure that has been destroyed deliberately by the Israelis. We hear these voices from now and then. However, the result at the end of the day, the outcome is the same. Israel is going to get its support regardless the objection of some Democrats, and the U.S. administration will continue supporting the Israelis, whatever they do.
Okay. Now, Walter, the U.S. national security strategy calls for protecting human rights in foreign policy. At the same time, it also pledges to maintain an ironclad commitment to Israeli military aid, and that despite apparent contradiction with declared U.S. policy objectives like the two-state solution and the annexation of the West Bank, home demolitions, and evictions. So how come we can see this clear dichotomy?
Well, I think to the United States, and especially to the people in the State Department who are in large part responsible for managing the so-called soft power that the United States projects around the world, this language, this rhetoric of human rights, democracy is quite useful, but it's simply a tool. It has no true meaning behind it. For instance, Saudi Arabia, right? I mean, Israel proves this point, but, to take another example, Saudi Arabia receives huge amounts of military support from the United States and other forms of political and material backing. And yet that is, perhaps the most repressive regime on the planet. I mean, it's a place where people are publicly executed for the crime of witchcraft. I mean, human rights, it's completely laughable that human rights has anything to do with U.S. foreign policy, but it is very helpful, and it's helpful for supporters of Israel as well, because they have this line that that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. I mean, it's total nonsense, but it's something that allows them to sell their extremely hardline warmongering policies to people around the world, but I think primarily to a section of the population of the United States who have liberal or progressive sympathies, who are generally in favor of human rights, in favor of democracy, believe that people are equal, but by framing it in terms of human rights or a humanitarian responsibility to intervene, or supporting democracy, they're able to get that section of the population, which would be otherwise generally skeptical of U.S. military action or other forms of intervention abroad, on board with just that type of activity, like the nearly $4 billion a year that goes to the Israeli war machine. So it's essentially a public relations maneuver. I think that's all the human rights rhetoric is really about, because of course, Israel, and I mean, Israel has been labeled an apartheid state for a long time by supporters of the Palestinian cause. But, even like very mainstream liberal human rights organizations like Amnesty International, like B'Tselem in Israel itself, are now saying, like, look, there's no denying it. This is apartheid. And apartheid is also a crime under international law. So it's an absolute abject exercise in hypocrisy for the United States to say that on the one hand we are arming to the teeth this viciously aggressive apartheid regime called Israel, but on the other we're the champion of human rights and democracy around the world.
Exactly. Let me put almost the same question to Elijah. Elijah, what's your take on that? We have the U.S., always boasting of human rights and being a harbinger and going to extremes to defend other parts of the world and people there to enjoy human rights. They topple governments, what they call regime change. At the same time, they're selling lethal weapons to Israelis. They're funding them, And how come they cannot open their eyes and see that there are people getting killed and they are Palestinians? And thanks to social media, despite the mainstream media that the U.S. is also using at its service, they now know what's happening to the Palestinians and their plight. So why don't they regard the Palestinians as people that they also have human rights?
Because the simple thing the world is asking from the Americans is to respect it's really not happening anywhere. We saw during Donald Trump era a president that was quite honest by saying, I want to go to Syria and steal the oil. I asked the Saudis and blackmailed them, and I want them to pay me today $500 million. So this is the real face of the United States administration, is to blackmail countries, is to steal, and is to give a damn about the international law. So killing hundreds of Palestinians, children, women, civilians, and destroy a city that is like in a concentration camp is really irrelevant to the Israelis. And the proof is that for days during the first week of the war, the Americans opposed the ceasefire. They didn't want to. They want to allow Israel to continue bombing. That is not humanitarian approach. This is really hypocrisy and the violation, a clear violation of international laws. What we observe today is we observe a world that is live in a jungle. Whoever can be and take whatever he can, this is the person who can prevail over another weak country. And this is what the Americans are allowing Israel to do when they give them the best war machine to kill more Palestinians like they do with the Saudis against the Yemeni. There is no respect of international law, as simple as that.
Now, Walter, it may be true that a growing number of voters in the House are supporting initiatives to kind of restrict U.S. aid to Israel, and that's due to its human rights violations. Still, there is another challenge, and that is establishing transparent weapons transfer practices to ensure tracking and end-use monitoring. Could that ever happen?
Well, I mean, there would have to be the political will to enforce it, which I would be quite skeptical of. I mean, the U.S. armed forces and the Israeli armed forces, work very closely together. The idea that, it kind of reminds me of people who say that, the police should be in charge of, police in the United States should be in charge of investigating police shootings, right? I mean, it's something where, you would be placing probably a State Department or Department of Defense regulator, inspector general in charge of tracking these things. But because of the, political milieu that they're in, their career, I mean, it's what their job is. I think the odds of finding U.S. officials who are willing to do that type of, minute track, I think that's likely just a smokescreen to say that, we can make sure that these particular bombs don't go to, blow up schools or hospitals or residential building blocks. But regardless, I mean, it's bolstering the arsenal of a military that does just that on a routine, regular basis. So I would be very skeptical of measures that argue that, if we do proper monitoring, then that could reduce or eliminate the odds that the United States would be sort of very directly involved in war crimes. I don't really accept that argument.
Okay, Elijah, we only have 1 minute for you if you want to add to your comments.
Yes, I would like to say that we should not be surprised when the Americans are supporting the Israeli in the war on Gaza, because the Americans have been killing people all over the world in every single war they were carrying out, and by hundreds of thousands. Therefore, they're not going to move for killing a few hundred Palestinians by the Israelis. It's a deja vu, and the war that the Americans have carried out in Afghanistan, in Iraq, everywhere has been destructive 100,000 times more than what the Israelis are doing. Therefore, we should not expect anything good coming from the American administration, any American administration, the previous, the current, and the following one.
Okay. On that note, we come to the end of this debate show on Press TV. Let me thank our guests. We had journalist and political analyst Elijah Magnier in Brussels and editor of the Liberation News, Walter Smolarek in Philadelphia. And thank you for watching this debate show. I've been your host, Behruz Najafin. I'll see you later.